central banks all over the world printing huge amounts of money at an unprecedented level. Never in world history has it happened like this. And governments borrowing and spending huge amounts of money. So we have had a good time. I mean, Brad, if you give me $2 or $3 trillion, I'll show you a very good time. And lots of euphoria sets in. Then you start having a reaction, such as higher interest rates, inflation, and that's what's happening now.
Today, my guest is Jim Rogers. Jim is a legendary investor. He's worked with people like George Soros. He's the author of many books, and he's an expert in commodities and the world economy. This first question comes from one of our listeners, and he'd like to know, what do you think a market looks like when it's at the bottom and ready to rise again?
It's happened many, many times all over the world throughout history. Everybody has given up in despair. Everybody is explaining why they will never invest in that asset again. Everybody is explaining why it's rigged, it's not fair, they cheat you, etc. And that many companies will be going bankrupt. If it's stocks, they'll be talking about how many companies will be going bankrupt and that it's going to be an economic disaster. There's despair, everybody. There is despair everywhere.
And you believe that's when it looks like it will turn and go back up?
Well, not necessarily going to turn around and go back up, but at least you know you're getting at the bottom or close to the bottom. Then frequently something will happen. Well, first of all, that may be enough. Just the very fact that it's hit the bottom, and there's so much despair everywhere, that will frequently lead to the turn. But especially if something, lower interest rates, end of a war, lots of things can then lead to an actual event. Mm-hmm. But sometimes just hitting the bottom is enough.
Mm-hmm. And Jim, what is your assessment of the global economy at the moment?
Well, for the last 10 or 12 years, we've had central banks all over the world printing huge amounts of money at an unprecedented level. Never in world history has it happened like this. And governments borrowing and spending huge amounts of money. So we have had a good time. I mean, Brad, if you give me $2 or $3 trillion, I'll show you a very good time. Yes. We'll all have a very, very good time, and that's what's been happening. It cannot go, it's never gone on forever. It's probably not going on forever. Usually when things get very high and lots of euphoria sets in, then you start having a reaction, such as higher interest rates, inflation, whatever, and that's what's happening now.
Mm-hmm. And Jim, you're an expert in many things, one of them being commodities. What do you make of the possible regulation of Bitcoin as a commodity?
Well, as far as I'm concerned, if people want to trade Bitcoin, let them. It's a trading vehicle for many people that has been successful for some people. I guess the governments like to regulate and touch everything, and so governments see that and say, "Wait, we got to get in on this." I guess if they want to regulate it, why not? The less regulation of anything, the better, as far as I'm concerned. Mm-hmm. But certainly, people apparently have been scammed by cryptocurrencies, and so I guess the government needs to step in. It's certainly going to be a huge amount of money involved. So yes, certainly, I guess it does need someone to look at it.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and there was a lot of discussion of people who thought maybe they were spotting when the bubble was ready to burst with cryptocurrency. What does a bubble look like to you?
Well, all bubbles are pretty much the same. Everybody's talking about how it is different. It is different this time. You don't understand. You're too old. You don't know what's going on. And explaining why this is the wave of the future and the great new thing, and that it's going to change everything and it's going to replace X, whatever X happens to be. And I mean, all bubbles look the same. All bubbles sound the same. People leave their jobs to go into the new bubble, whatever the bubble is. They tell their wives and girlfriends and husbands how wonderful it is and how much money they are making and how much more they will make. They go into the bar and all they can talk about is, this new world. It happens the same way all the time, all over the world.
And another thing that we're seeing is a rising of inflation. I wonder, what strategies have you used to deal with inflation?
Well, when there's inflation, if you own the things that are going to go up in price, you will do okay. You might even make a lot of money. When there's inflation, the price of metals or fuel or food goes up by definition. So if you own those things, you will do okay. You might even make a lot of money. Silver and gold are also two, well, they're metals, but two other metals. If you own the things that are going to rise in price, you'll do fine.
Mm-hmm. What do you see ahead for the economy as inflation continues to rise, or should it continue to rise?
Well, in America, we've had the longest period in American history of a economy and markets without big problems. It's never lasted this long. It's now 13 years. Now, maybe it's going to last 30 years. I don't know. But I know, at least on a historic basis, we're getting towards the end. And I start to see the signs. You see SPACs. SPACs have been around for 300 years, but they always have a revival. They often have a revival at the end of a bull market. You see lots of new investors coming in. Always happens. They call up their friends and say, I've discovered this new thing called the stock market, and it's fun, and you can make money, and it's easy. You know, all of these things have happened before, and they're happening again.
Mm-hmm. In general, what do you see ahead for the U.S. dollar?
Well, the U.S. is the largest debtor nation in world history, and it's getting worse every day. So, and the U.S. dollar has been the world's reserve currency for several decades now. No reserve currency has lasted more than 100, 150 years in history. We've had many, but they always change. The U.S. has been around on top a long time, so we're coming to the end. I hope we're not at the end yet. I own a lot of U.S. dollars. You probably should say, well, why do you own U.S. dollars after what you just said? I own them because in times of turmoil, people look for a safe haven. For historic reasons, people think the U.S. dollar is a safe haven. It's not. I tell you, we're the largest debtor nation in world history. But people think it is. So when the turmoil gets worse, the dollar will go higher, might even turn into a bubble. And I hope I'll be smart enough at that point to get out of my dollars, because we're certainly getting towards the end.
Mm-hmm. What do you think the end would look like? What would you be trying to spot?
First of all, it get too expensive, get expensive. Who knows what is the word too expensive is, but it'll get higher and higher, and more people will be switching into U.S. dollars from other currencies. Doing business in the U.S. will become very expensive because the dollar is so high, and other countries will start to get a competitive advantage. And somebody will start looking at, hey, look at that currency. That's a sound currency. I don't know what that currency is yet, by the way. If you know what's going to compete with the dollar, don't announce it, please. Just send me an email. I'm looking for what's going to be the next competitor. But people will start noticing currency X, and people start moving that way. None of this happens in a week or a month or a year even. This is a long-term movement. When the pound sterling lost its status, it took several months, years for it to be complete. But you will start to see more imbalances in the U.S. The balance of trade is getting worse and worse, and that will get worse. Debt will go higher. It always happens at the end, and that is starting to happen in the U.S. But as I say, I own a lot of U.S. dollars at the moment.
Mm-hmm. And Jim, you mentioned people moving into U.S. dollars with turmoil in the world. I wonder, what effect have you seen the war in Ukraine have on the global economy?
Wars always cause distortions and dislocation, certainly in the commodity markets. You know, that always makes the price of copper go up. I mean, bullets need copper and lead. So the things that armies need and use go higher in price as they get scarcer. Agriculture usually benefits because you can't plant crops when there's a war going on usually. So commodities are real assets, or the things that nations and armies need, and it gets more and more difficult to produce, go up in price. That's already happened. They're coming down now because the war seems to be cooling off a little bit, but it has certainly distorted many markets. The Europeans may be running out of, have run out of natural gas, so that's going to cause more distortions. When there's a war, there's always one side or the other which starts putting on sanctions and controls and regulations, and it distorts markets, and it's happening again.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned sanctions too. What efficacy do you think sanctions really have, or do they?
Well, in my experience, sanctions rarely work very much, maybe for a very short period of time and maybe for a few very narrow sectors. But human beings are smart enough, they say, well, let's get around the sanctions, and people always figure out a way to get around the sanctions. Black markets develop somewhere. So sanctions are not, in my experience, not terribly effective for very long.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Another country that's of interest right now, of course, is China, and you've written about your experience in China. What do you see happening with the Chinese economy right now?
Well, the Chinese economy has had a big real estate boom for several years, turned into a bubble in many parts of China. The government in Beijing has been trying to cool it off. They've been talking it down for several years. Nothing ever seemed to work. Now the market itself and maybe the Chinese government, whatever is combined to make the prices come down, the bubble has popped in much of China. And as when all bubbles pop, somebody starts suffering and going bankrupt, and it's starting to happen in China. There was huge speculation by many people in Chinese property, and it's coming down, and it's going to affect the whole world, but certainly the whole Chinese economy. You know, in the 1920s, we had a similar problem in the U.S. Finally, the Florida land boom popped and helped lead to the Great Depression. We're starting to see the bubble finally pop in China, and it is having an effect on the Chinese economy, and it will continue to.
Mm-hmm. As it does, what do you think the ripple effect around the world would be with an event like that in China?
Well, China is the second largest economy in the world, or maybe the largest, depending on how you measure. So when the second largest economy in the world has a problem, everybody's affected, and many people are affected, and that is having an effect. And if it gets worse, it will start spreading to other countries as well. And then we're going to have another recession. We've always had recessions. I don't know when the next one's coming, but whenever it does come, it's not going to be good. And the problems in China will be part of it.
Mm-hmm. So, Jim, you're coming to us today from Singapore. I wonder, what drew you to Singapore?
Well, I wanted my children to speak Mandarin and to know Asia, because in their lifetimes, Mandarin is going to be extremely important, and Asia is going to be extremely important. So I moved here so they would know Asia and could speak Chinese, mm-hmm. and it's worked.
Mm-hmm. And along with learning Chinese, what else do you hope that your daughters can gain from that experience in Singapore?
Well, we all know that Asian education is very rigorous and demanding and advanced. The Asian kids always win the international contests when they have contests or tests for education, and it's certainly, I can tell you, it is very, very rigorous. So I know that they're getting an advanced education and rigorous education. That's not going to make them successful, but it probably won't hurt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Jim, you've shown a lot of passion for international travel. You've been on a lot of adventures. What draws you to travel, particularly international travel in general?
Well, I grew up in a small backwoods town where my phone number was 5. And I guess if you grow up in a town where your phone number is 5, you probably never leave, or you probably want to see a lot more. And I was one of those nuts who wanted to see it all and have adventure and see the world from the ground up and see what was really happening out there. And the more I did it, the more I wanted.
Mm-hmm. So from that small town, how did you end up in Wall Street and finance and all of this?
Oh, it was all an accident. I applied for a scholarship to Yale, which I got I didn't know what I was doing. I had no clue what I was doing. And as soon as I got to Yale, I knew I was in way over my head. But since I was in over my head, I had to struggle and work hard, and did so and did okay. And in the end, I wound up with a summer job on Wall Street, again, because I liked the guy and he liked me. I didn't know anything about Wall Street. I knew it was in New York. I knew something bad had happened in 1929, but I didn't know there was a difference in stocks and bonds. As far as I knew, they were the same thing. But it didn't take me long to realize how much I loved the investment world, because it was a reflection of everything happening in life and in the world. And that was my passion. I didn't know when I was 21 years old that I loved current affairs of what was going on in the world. But it sank in, and I realized, and I said, oh my gosh, here's a place they'll pay me to do what I love.
Yes. So you spent this time on Wall Street, and then you end up going out on these adventures. How did you transition to what looks something like an early retirement and the bike trips and things like that?
Well, I had always wanted to have, I mean, these are things I said when I was young. Who knew I knew what I was talking about, but I'd always said I was going to have more than one life, more than one career. I didn't want to wake up one day at 90 years old, still sitting in front of a Wall Street computer. So I set out to have more than one life. When one of my dreams, goals, ambitions was to go around the world on a motorcycle. I knew how exciting and fun motorcycles were. And I knew it was certainly the best way to see the world, because you're right in it. You can't avoid it. Mm-hmm. And eventually, well, in those days, it was impossible because of Soviet Union, Red China, Iron Curtain, things like that. But eventually I got permission, and off I went.
What do you think was one of your favorite events while making that trip around the world?
Surviving, making it. Many people try things like this. Very few make it. Very few survive. Even if they survive, they don't make it. No, the success rate is almost zero on something like this. I'm delighted to be alive, and I'm delighted to have my arms and legs, and I'm delighted to have made it.
Yes. Well, Jim,
it was great fun. I loved every minute of it, even the bad times. I was once held hostage in the Congo in the middle of Africa for 8 or 9 days, but everything was, in the end, everything was great since I'm alive and well.
What was that like, being hostage in the Congo?
It was the police chief who held us hostage. He felt we had money. It was pleasant. He took us home to his house for dinner. We went to the nightclub. We did all sorts of things together, but he just wouldn't let us leave. Finally, we convinced him he had all our money, and off we went.
Wow. Well, Jim, obviously you are a fascinating man with many lives. For people who want to learn more about you, where should they look for you online?
Well, I have a website, but there's really nothing there. It's just it's the schedule of what I'm doing. If I'm doing anything, it talks about my books. I'm afraid, Brad, I don't have anything to sell. So I guess you could read my books or go to my website, but I don't have anything to sell. So my answer to you is not much.
Okay. Well, we'll put links to your books in the description for people who are interested in reading about all of that. And Jim, my final question is, what do you recommend for people who want to live a life of adventure like you have?
Do it. You don't have to have a lot of money. Of course, it helps, depending. But you don't have to stay in 5-star hotels, eat in Michelin restaurants. You can do it one way or the other. If you really want to do it, figure out a way to do it, either 5-star or 1-star or 5 roach. Figure out a way to do it and do it. I always thought, well, gosh, someday I might wake up and I'll be 90 years old and I'll say, oh my gosh, I always wish I had tried this or tried that. And I know many people who do wind up when they're old saying, oh, I always wish I had tried this or tried that. My advice is to do it, because otherwise you're going to regret it the rest of your life. And even if you fail at whatever it is, you will at least won't have regrets, and you will learn something. If you fail, you'll certainly learn something. So my advice is to figure out a way to do it. No matter how many people tell you it's absurd, do it.
Mm-hmm. Well, Jim, thank you for having the courage to do it and to share your story with everyone. I really appreciate this. Thank you.
Thank you, Brad. My pleasure. Let's do it again sometime.
Thanks for watching this episode with Jim Rogers. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe.